Okay, good morning, everyone. It's my great honor to be here to celebrate 50th anniversary of the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies. So actually, I was here about 10 years ago to talk about North Korea policy. And this time, we came here to Korea to have discussions about democratic crisis and how to recover from that democratic backsliding. So last year, our center, Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford, and the foundation, we launched it, what we call Sustainable Democracy Roundtable. So about a dozen of my colleagues from US and Europe came to attend this roundtable. So this is sort of our last session to talk about democratic issues. So, as you know, liberal democracies around the world, old and new, American and European, and also Asian, including Korea, have faced serious challenges in the past decade. Okay, these include illiberalism, populism, political polarization, as well as the influence of what we call sharp powers led by China and Russia. So how can we protect our democracies in the face of these pressing challenges? Are there common causes of democratic backsliding and solutions for the recovery? Or are these causes and solutions specific to a particular region or a country? So what can we learn from each other? So today in our panel, we have four panelists from my colleague, Larry Diamond, and Professor Daniel Karamara from European Union Institute, and then my friend and colleague, Professor Kim Sun-hyuk from Korea University, and Jo-An Cho from Wesleyan University. So I think what we are going to do, this panel, is that I'm going to invite each panelist make some opening comments, no more than 5 minutes. Try to maybe highlight one or two points, and then I have a conversation, then open up to the floor for questions. So let's start with Larry, and let's welcome. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Gi-wook, and again, I add my warm congratulations to the Korean Foundation for Advanced Studies. It's really a remarkable achievement, and I must say I'm really admiring your library here and how high it rises. It's very inspiring. I'm not going to talk about causes because there isn't time in 5 minutes. So let me talk about what is to be done, and in doing that, I think I will obliquely make reference to some of the causes. I think that we have become somewhat apathetic about democracy, about the values of democracy, the normative commitments and requirements of democracy, the need for tolerance, compromise, mutual respect. Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt put it very well in their book, How Democracies Die. Mutual tolerance and mutual restraint, the willingness of actors to forego the maximum exploitation of power that they might pursue in order to marginalize and punish their rivals. They call it mutual forbearance. And it's not surprising when you think about it that there is a tendency to normative erosion. When you start a democracy after a long period of pretty brutal dictatorship and very serious human rights violations, including the types that occurred in this country, or under the worst days of KMT rule in Taiwan, or under any of the communist regimes, however much they had evolved, or under the military dictatorships of Latin America, or the one-party and one-man dictatorships, as well as military dictatorships in Africa. When you enter a democracy after that, people know what they don't want. They have a very vivid memory of the abuse of power, the terror, the fear, the price to be paid in human terms, in human dignity, for the loss of freedom. And I do think it's very important to recall Frank's emphasis from his keynote remarks on freedom as really, it's not just democracy we want. Of course, we value popular sovereignty and the ability of people to chart their own destiny and choose and replace their own leaders, and the mechanisms of accountability that come from that. But it's the restraint of state power through constitutionalism and rule of law, and the protection of human rights and the basic freedoms in the Universal Declaration and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which underscore that these are not just Western values, and I think we should never talk about them as Western values. They're universal values. And with time, we've come to take them for granted. And I think civic education as a mission has eroded. It certainly has in the United States. It's become a kind of boring and almost laughable subject. The elevating work that groups were doing, civic education groups in Latin America and Central and Eastern Europe and so on, to educate for democracy and emphasize the values of constitutionalism, rule of law, restraint of power, and freedom, we kind of lost the energy. We felt we had done that. We checked the box and moved on. And I think we have entered a period where we're absorbed with social media, we're intensely polarized, we're lost in our social media echo chambers, and tolerance, civility, the willingness to listen, the readiness to engage in rational, evidence-based debate, all of these have eroded. Let me say we just released today, a few hours ago, a report of a committee that I co-chaired at Stanford University on anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli bias. And a lot of the conclusions we came to is if you want to fight bias of any kind, against Jews, against Israelis, against Muslims, against Palestinians, against Asians, Chinese, whoever, it helps to elevate core values of that universities really were founded on, of pluralism, of tolerance, of civil discourse, of rational evidence-based debate. These have severely eroded in the academy in the United States and I think Europe. I don't know about Korea. We could talk about that. And I think it's an important mission for this foundation actually to support work that can try to recover them. And if we don't fight for these values and think about how to transmit them across generations and across borders, using the means, the memes, the techniques, the excitement that young people live in these days in a social media world, as well as reaching out to older citizens as well, I think that we may be fighting a losing battle. I have a lot to say, as you know, Gi-wook, about how to counter the drift toward authoritarian populism and push back, and how some democratic political parties, coalitions, and movements are doing that. But in the spirit of your request, I'll leave that for the discussion.
Okay, so I'll come back to that point. Now, Daniel.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this important anniversary for the foundation. I'm a student and a scholar of institutions and political systems, and I would like to talk about liberal democracy from the perspective of representative democracy, because I think this is the system that is being challenged today, and we heard a lot about these threats to liberal and representative democracy from populism, so people versus the elites, but I think it is a bit more complex than that. The challenge is also coming from a deep distrust that people have in the capacity of people themselves to make important and complex decisions, to think in the long term, and for democracies to act in an effective way. So I think that the challenge is not only one that comes from populism, but also one that comes from a sort of admiration for more effective systems that can decide in more efficient ways, and if necessary also in non-democratic ways. And this is obviously very dangerous because it undermines representative democracy. And in fact, representative democracy was and I hope it will still be in the future, extremely successful in being able to bridge the demands for people's participation on the one hand, but also effective action. And this has developed over, I would say, a century and a half, starting in Europe and in the US, and then spreading around the world. And it is a remarkable achievement. I think, and I agree with what Larry Diamond has just said, we need to reevaluate the importance of this system, reevaluate and stop delegitimizing. Now, about what we can do to save it. There are a lot of proposals that say we need more direct democracy, or we need citizens' assemblies, and there are experiments of this kind in Europe, for example, in Ireland, in Belgium, but also in the US, in Australia. I think the priority should be to work on saving representative democracy before introducing new institutions. And of course, it's easier to talk about problems than solutions, but let me try to make 3 points. And usually, scholars of political system have this division between politics, policy, and polity. So let me try to give some concrete solutions for each of them. Let me start with the polity, the institutions. There are things that we can do to protect democracies. And one would be, for example, electoral systems. And we can learn from other experiences. For example, things that we should not do. I don't want to be disrespectful, but I think the US has a terrible electoral system.
I agree.
The way in which the districts are organized, gerrymandering that Professor Yu mentioned, but also the independence of electoral authorities, the registration system. I mean, these are all causes of polarization, of discontent, of also apathy, has been mentioned. We can reform the finance of political parties. The primaries are a factor of great polarization between the candidates within the same party. On policies, I think there the priority should be to rebuild some reference points and try to bridge the divides that characterize our society between rural and urban, young and old, poor and rich, educated and not educated people. And we can do that with very concrete policies, housing policies, schooling policies, transportation policies, and public services, the presence of public services in rural villages that feel completely disconnected in France, but also in the US and in many parts. And finally, politics. And here I think in politics, I mean, the priority is obviously to depolarize and to depersonalize. And I think the priority here is to stop legitimizing political parties. Political parties have a very important role to play because they are able to connect elites and masses. They govern and they represent at the same time. And it is a big mistake, for example, other things that we can learn from other countries, what has happened in France. In France, the traditional political parties have been delegitimized by a narrative that parties are not helpful, left and right don't exist. We need to solve problems in a technocratic way. And when then protest emerges because of discontent with certain policies, the choices are gone. So the priority here is to rebuild a moderate choice. And this means, because, I mean, the consequence of Macron's actions has been that the only choices that are left are at the extremes. Now, I conclude. I think elites, leaders, politicians have a lot of responsibilities. But voters too, citizens have also a great responsibility. Being a citizen is hard. You need to be informed, you need to debate, you need to confront your opinions with other people. It is hard work. But liberal democracies were built on this confidence that citizens are able to do this, and are able to do this in a rational way. It is a system that relies on competent citizens. Of course, today we vote with the guts. Okay, it's a very instinctive vote. This has to stop, and we need to regain more rationality in electoral participation.
Okay, thank you. So now, Sonyak.
It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I think we have already heard a lot about prescriptions and some solutions about the problem, but I'd like to take one step back and talk about South Korea. Right, so Kyu summarized the challenges to democracy, illiberalism, and also polarization, and populism and sharp powers. And I'd like to reflect on those 4 different categories in terms of South Korean democracy. A while ago, I think the Varieties of Democracy project managed by Göteborg University in Sweden had a concerning report about South Korea, as many of you have already known. And the report says that our democracy is autocratizing itself, right? So it's going toward the direction of autocracy. Very, very big concern about the quality of South Korean democracy. But all in all, I choose to disagree with the report, because I think in comparative perspective, in terms of illiberalism, populism, political polarization as well, and sharp powers, I think South Korean democracy is in good shape. And I think there are some, of course, there are some problems and there are some concerns, but nevertheless, I think in comparative perspective, I have to report that South Korean democracy is in good shape. And let me first explain some of the bad news first, and then turn to good news in the latter part. Of course, because we had this big legacy, we have this big legacy of the developmental state, right? The South Korean populace in general has very ambivalent attitude toward political authoritarianism, right? Authoritarianism in this country is not unquestionably bad thing, right? Because it was accompanied during the developmental years. It was accompanied this phenomenal economic growth and economic development. So people have mixed feelings about that, and some segment of the population thinks that those authoritarian years was good old days, right? But nevertheless, I think I will explain later some of the good news. But I think that developmental legacy is not really a big determinant of some bad aspects of some challenges to South Korean democracy. On the other hand, of course, and because of also as a result of this, the developmental legacy, some citizens definitely prefer performance. So they emphasize performance, and they emphasize democracy as a system that is not necessarily by the people, but for the people. So it should deliver. The state should deliver something for the people. So that's also emphasized. So that's some worrisome aspect. On the other hand, we also need to point to the fact that, I mean, in South Korea, liberalism in general is not that strong, I should say. The notion of democracy we had during our struggle for democracy was largely electoralist. We equated democracy with direct election of the president, and that's about it. I mean, we didn't think that much about a liberal form of democracy, free speech, and freedoms of all different liberal rights, civic rights, democracy requires, and so on. And also, we didn't put democracy in this framework between individual rights versus collective rights, individuals versus the state. So we didn't have that deeply philosophical definition or consensus or agreement or any debate on democracy. So that's the weakness. On the other hand, we also suffer from fandom politics. Fandom is very important asset politicians should have these days in South Korea. I mean, the propelled by SNS and the development of the internet. And I mean, we fortunately lack political engineers and political entrepreneurs who can feed on these populist tendencies of the people so far, but I think we are not totally immune to this temptation of populism also. I also need to point in terms of weaknesses, I need to point to the increasing judicialization and even prosecutorialization of politics, and the politicians in general in South Korea have recourse to judicial process or prosecutorial process to solve political problems. So political society does not work very efficiently to solve political problems, and that's why they rely on judicial process and the increased litigiousness of politics in the country. Let me turn to now good news. We have, I think, in my opinion, we have rather very strong tradition of constitutionalism. Constitution revision, arbitrary constitution revision. I mean, one of the basic requirements of a populist politics is to change institutions. I mean, to the favor of populists, right? And to the favor of populist politics. That is very difficult to happen in this country because we have this aversion to constitution revision. Constitution revision in the old days, during the authoritarian periods, was abused as a mechanism to elongate the tenure of the president usually. And people have a lot of reservations about constitution revision. That's why I think despite this big support for the move to parliamentary and constitutional structure, we have not had yet constitutional revision because of the difficulty of the process. On the other hand, I think as compared with I already mentioned this developmentalism in South Korea, and we have a legacy of the developmental state. We have a very strong developmental state. I'm not sure whether the developmental state is really deceased these days. I think there are new forms of neo-developmental or post-developmental state in this country. But on the other hand, I think it's a virtue that we have also similarly strong civil society, similarly mobilizational, similarly combatant, similarly rebellious civil society, contentious civil society, and South Korean politics has been characterized again and again by this contentious confrontation between very strong state and very strong civil society. So that's a virtue. On the other hand, I think because in terms of this demand side of populism or liberalism, I think the demand is not that strong because the South Korean state is relatively performing well. I mean, as a result of the legacy of the developmental state, in comparative perspective, the South Korean state has been performing relatively well in delivering the goods and services demanded by the people. And so I think of course, we have a lot of things to work on, but nevertheless, I think in comparative perspective, the state has been performing well. I have to add also that we have a very high quality bureaucracy so far, and also the policy delivery has been relatively okay.
Sonia, can you wrap up? Yeah.
All right.
So you spent already
All right.
7-8 minutes.
Right. And I also have to point out that, I mean, the populism generally in this country, it has been denigrated because of the bad publicity of populism. So I think there have been populist tendencies, and populism sometimes has been used as an epithet for attacking the other side of the politics, the other side, the political opponents. But rather, populism, I mean, is a very polluted word in this country, and so I think that also has been effective in immunizing the polity from the rampant pervasion of the populism also. All right, I should stop here.
Okay, thank you, Joanne, for your remarks.
My name is Joan Cho. I'm an associate professor of East Asian Studies and Government at Wesleyan University. It's an honor to be on this panel, and I myself am not a recipient of KFAS scholarship. I have a lot of friends and colleagues who are recipients of KFAS scholarship, and I really admire their work. So I really congratulate for the achievements and what the foundation has done for the past 50 years. I'm going to complement the remarks made by my fellow panelists by explaining the common causes of democratic backsliding across country and region. And building on those points, I will make only one point about the solution, so we can save other points for the discussion. So I want to start out with the point that democratic backsliding is not just specific to particular countries or region. It's highly diverse. You know, it has happened in countries, even in the U.S. and other upper and middle income countries, on the European periphery, to poor countries such as Bolivia, Ecuador, and Zambia. So this is a very common phenomenon. And the common causes seems to be political polarization, which has already been mentioned. In addition to political polarization, underlying anti-elite sentiment, populist sentiment, nativist sentiments, these seem to be the common cause. And so what explains political polarization? Of course, there are many things, but economic factors, including financial crisis, racial, ethnic division within the country, cultural differences between cosmopolitan and nationalists, as well as religious versus secular worldviews that all contribute to polarization in different parts of the world. And polarization contributes to democratic backsliding because it gives rise to autocratic leaders who attack democratic institutions, to strengthen the power of the executive, to tilt the level playing field. So at the elite level, as in among politicians, polarization reduces the political incentive to abide by the normative guardrails of democracy, which Professor Diamond has already talked about. So with increased effective polarization, politics becomes more of a security dilemma, more of a zero-sum game. And this enables incumbent parties to move towards the extremes, or they will allow extreme outsiders to be a part of the mainstream parties. And these parties and individuals will also gain traction from the electorate that is also polarized, and they become more vulnerable to these extreme views and appeals. And so this is how political polarization contributes to democratic backsliding across countries and region. So thinking about, are there some common features that lead to democratic backsliding, given that there are political polarization? So not surprisingly, new democracies, countries that have transitioned into democracy for not so much time, they are most vulnerable to democratic backsliding, and they are most crisis prone when these countries have weak states, volatile economies, entrenched inequality, and widespread poverty and criminal violence. It shouldn't be a surprise that poor economic performance, corruption, rising crime rates, and insufficient and ineffective social policies will generate a lot of broad public discontent, and that also contributes to being appealed to leaders who have extreme views and provide solutions that they will take care of these problems, right? And indeed, Stephen Hackett and Robert Kaufman, they find that democracies most at risk of reversion to authoritarianism are those that are more weakly institutionalized. So when we say weakly institutionalized, these countries lack the horizontal checks and balances that Professor Yu have talked about in the previous panel. They also have weaker political and social organizations, so weak parties that Professor Kalamani talked about. So when you have weak political and social organizations, it is harder for them to push back against executive overreach that leads to backsliding, right? So in a sense, weak states and weak institutions make the country more vulnerable to backsliding. So this naturally connects to the one point that I want to make about solution, right? So it is implied in my discussion so far and what we have heard from the panel on the US election that and also what Professor Fukuyama has highlighted, that strong states and strong institutions with checks and balances can act as effective counterweights to attempts at executive overreach. In the U.S., the federal courts actually blocked several of Trump's executive orders, like travel ban and things like that. And in addition to the judicial branch doing this, there were counter mobilization from civil society. The media, despite being attacked, they still continue to investigate and report on the administration's actions. So I just wanted to underscore the importance of strong states with effective bureaucracy that is responsible to people's demand and having these strong institutions to act as guardrails to be important in counteracting democratic backsliding.
Okay, thank you. There was one comment from the audience saying that this session is really interesting. So we are making more interesting by becoming more provocative. Okay, so let me start with Larry and Danielle. Let's take one step back because a lot of people quite puzzled with what's happening in the United States and also in Western Europe. Because oftentimes I compare today with 1930s and 1940s when liberal democracy was threatened by fascism and communism. And it was United States and UK who led defending liberal democracy from fascism and communism. But I'm not sure whether we can expect US or UK or any other country to do that in the face of a lot of challenges. So before getting into solution, let's one step back. So what's going on in the United States? Because when Trump came to run for president, I thought it's quite entertaining. It's a good thing to make politics more interesting. But I never thought that he would become president of the United States. And then still we are talking about him. I mean, even today. So in the highly polarized in the United States as well. So what is going on in the United States? How can you explain to, let's say, our Korean audience?
Well, there are a lot of questions packed up into that. First of all, the problem is not the UK. Boris Johnson was as bad as it got, and he can't hold a candle to Trump in terms of his defection from democratic norms. The UK is going to have a relatively normal democratic election on July 4th between two more or less normal left of center and right of center political alternatives. One of them is going to win. The results are going to be announced quickly. The campaign is going to be short. The results will be accepted by everybody. I don't think democracy in the UK is in particular trouble. It is in very deep trouble in the United States. And we're seeing GWOC an interaction among a wide range of factors. We really don't have the time to unpack it all here. There are economic drivers here in terms of rising inequality and the decline of intergenerational mobility. Frank made some reference to that. I think social media has been a very big factor here in contributing to polarization. People ask me, why did the democratic recession begin around 2006, 2007? Well, Frank, in talking about the period 2005 to 2014 and the onset of financial crises and so on, that's part of it. The misadventures and imperial overreach of the United States in Iraq in particular, I actually don't agree with him that the invasion of Afghanistan was a mistake. I think if we had only focused on Afghanistan and not invaded Iraq on specious grounds, we could have sustained an engagement there, but that's a side issue. But 2006, 2007, that's when social media really began to penetrate in a very comprehensive way the politics and kind of social relations of the United States, Europe, ultimately the most wired country in the world, the one we're in right now, and others as well. I think also to understand the United States, Daniel spoke about political institutions and electoral institutions. He was actually not sufficiently harsh on the United States, in my view, because it's not just about electoral administration. It's not just about gerrymandering. It's not just about campaign finance, which we cannot fix because of the warped way that the United States Supreme Court has interpreted the First Amendment to rule out essentially the regulation of campaign finance by equating the spending of money on political campaigns with free speech. It's also the very peculiar nature of our electoral system and the way it channels the social soil of polarization and turbocharges it in this area. So understand this. We have no second-tier electoral system, PR, like you do in Korea, and I think it's way too small in Korea, and certainly nothing of the extent of it in Japan. So we're really, we have 435 single-member districts for our Congress in the United States, and then, of course, the Senate, 2 senators. We're locked into that perversity of each state getting 2 senators for the upper chamber. And there are only 2 political choices that have any chance of winning in almost every district. And how do candidates get nominated in order to have a chance of winning in November? They have to win in 49 states, well, actually about 47, a party primary. And the party primaries get about, if they're lucky, 20% of the electorate to turn out. So if you are one political party that may dominate in a congressional district or in a state that's predominantly red or predominantly blue, you only need to get about 12% of the electorate in order to win the nomination. And then once you've won the nomination, you're guaranteed election. The election is essentially over in March, June, August, whenever you win the party nomination. You want to know why so many Republican members of Congress have gone to kiss the ring of Donald Trump? It's not that they like him. It's not that they admire him. It's a show that they put on for the cameras. They deride him and ridicule him in private. They kiss his ring and shine his shoes because they are afraid that if they don't bow down to this demagogue, this tyrant, that he will endorse somebody else in a low turnout party primary, and the 7, 8, 9, 10% of the electorate that's most fanatical for Donald Trump will defeat them in a party primary, and then they won't have a chance to win the general election. There actually is an antidote to this. It was adopted in the state of Alaska in 2020, and it's preferential voting with a nonpartisan primary. So in Alaska now, you don't have a partisan primary. You have a first round in the summer where all the candidates contend. And then the top 4 candidates, regardless of which party they are members of, advance to the general election. And then in the general election, preferential voting, ranked choice voting, as is used for the lower house of parliament in Australia, is used to pick the winner. And in order to win, you have to get 50% of the vote. And if you don't get 50% of first preference votes, there's an instant runoff that keeps going on until somebody wins. It's not a coincidence that the Republican senator who is least supportive of Trump, who has twice voted to impeach him, is the one who doesn't have to answer to the extremists in her party because she is elected from the state of Alaska by this other system, and that's Lisa Murkowski. We have ranked choice voting in Maine, albeit not with nonpartisan primaries. We now have the better system in Alaska. The Alaska option is essentially on the ballot as a voter initiative in Nevada this November. It won once in 2022, but because it's an amendment to the state constitution, it has to be adopted a second time in order to become law. And there's another ranked choice voting initiative on the ballot in Oregon. Let me tell you something. There's a reason why I'm a little bit cautiously optimistic. There are about 23 states in the United States that can amend their electoral system by voter initiative. They don't need the state legislatures to do it. And there's a movement building in the United States to do this because they see the toxicity, the perversity, and the undermining of democracy that is happening by the current system, which in the social and informational context we live in is greatly facilitating, number one, polarization, and number two, resignation to this demagogue.
Okay, thanks, Larry. So you identify the problem and also suggest some good solutions. So do you think like a big states like California, New York, Texas are likely to adopt this new system? Or Alaska, Maine, with all due respect, they are fairly small states.
Not all states have voter initiative.
Yeah.
And most politicians don't want to adopt changes in the system because they got elected by the system
right.
got elected by. You've been through this in Korea, they went through it in Japan. It's very hard to get electoral system change. But this brings us back to citizens, to civic education, to what I was talking about before. When you have a crisis of democracy, and we have a crisis of democracy in the United States now, and let me say, given the decline in civic values, given the rise in political violence, given the intimidation of electoral officials, given the disinformation, we will have a very serious problem of ill health and endangerment of our democracy, whether or not Trump wins in November of this year. So when you have a crisis of democracy, citizens need to mobilize to change the system, to restore it to good health. Our system is extremely antiquated. Danielle was exactly right in what he said. He just didn't go far enough. We could talk about the Constitutional Court in the United States, the Supreme Court, and the perversities there. We might talk about it with respect to Korea as well, Gi-wook. But we have a lot of work to do, and the only thing that gives me hope, actually, is not, kind of hanging on to the coattails of Biden and hope that this 81-year-old frail candidate will barely win again. It's the fact that at the grassroots, reform and momentum is building in civil society.
Okay, since we are talking about possible reform in electoral system, let me go to Korea first and come to Europe. So I think this goes to maybe Sunyoung and Joanne, either or both of you. In Korea, there's a lot of discussion about changing the current system. Like right now, Korea has a single-term, 5-year presidential system. So either making like a 2-term presidential system, or I've been advocating, changing into cabinet system. Also, some talks about changing single district in a system as well. So it looks like a lot of people agree on the necessity of changing those power structure or electoral system, but still nothing is really happening. So why is that? I mean, do you see any optimistic view about the future in changing those constitutional amendments?
Okay, so two different issues here. One is about the constitutional structure, and the other is the electoral system.
Right.
All right. Regarding the constitutional structure, I should say, basically, I mean, to begin with, I think I belong to this camp that I mean, whether this institutional rearrangement, institutional modifications would necessarily lead to better quality of democracy. I think you have to deal with a deeper level. But anyways, I mean, regarding the constitutional structure, there's this interesting discrepancy between what experts believe, experts support, and ordinary citizens believe. I mean, if you have a survey of experts, I'm not really sure about the exact number, but I think about 80 or even higher than 80% of the experts support the constitutional change from the current presidentialist structure to a parliamentarian structure. On the other hand, I mean, not that much support at all from ordinary citizens. I think we can point to different causes of this, but I think most of all, we had a parliamentarian constitutional structure in the earlier part of the 1960s, which Professor Han Sung-ju called the failure of democracy at the time because of the military coup of 1961. So I think these memories of the parliamentarian form of democracy we had about the early 1960s was not that positive. As well, I think the difficulty, the procedural difficulty of having a constitutional revision is also, I think, an additional hurdle about this. Regarding the electoral change, I mean, I totally agree with Larry about we need to have more increased proportionality, proportional representation system. The problem is that about 2 years ago, in the last general election, we tried to incorporate more element of proportionality in the elections, but that became a farce in a sense that I mean if you have a good well-intended innovation in the system, all these different political parties have a way of dealing with this. And they kind of created a satellite parties of their own, and they kind of took advantage of some defect of the proportional representation system. So I think after this incident in 2020 elections, the increasing the proportion of proportionality in the electoral system has become a very difficult task. I mean, it is not popular. It is sometimes ridiculed by ordinary citizens and also the political pundits as well. So I think we need a new momentum, perhaps I think civic mobilization once again for this kind of electoral change. So that's the current status of the two important reforms, institutional reforms in South Korea.
Joanne, you want to add?
I just wanted to add that as Professor Kim has pointed out, there was a very short parliamentary government, but it only lasted about 8 months because of the military coup in 1960. So we haven't really seen the fruits of it. So therefore, I think it is not automatically perceived as like this alternative form. But at the same time, if we think about how Korea democratized, we all know that popular uprising, the June Democratic Uprising, played a big role in being able to gain concession from the authoritarian regime at that time. And if you think back on the main slogans, it was down with the dictatorship, 독재 타도, and then direct presidential elections, 직선 개헌. So in some sense, democratization was equated with direct presidential elections. And in that framework, I think it might be hard, especially for the generation that fought for democracy at the expense of maybe even like their life, and actually seeing the fruits of Korea becoming a democracy and deepening as a democracy, to think of democratization and democracy that is outside of the framework of direct presidential elections. But perhaps as Professor Kim has alluded, if there is to be a new momentum, I think the new generation, they were born after Korea has already democratized, after Korea has already industrialized and became one of the most developed economies, and perhaps their perception of what democracy is and what kind of political system would be most suitable for Korea's democracy could be different. So perhaps there is solution with the younger generation, and I know we have a panel later on. So.
Okay, so now let's go to Daniel. So you identify 3 areas: politics, and policy. Can you share us what are some concrete efforts try to improve democracy in Europe? I think also one concern is now, European Union once looked very promising, but now not much so anymore. So if you can share what's going on in European Union and some efforts to strengthen democracy.
What is going on in Europe is in the next 2-3 weeks we have 2 very consequential elections in the UK and in France. These are the 2 nuclear powers in Europe. Both vote with a single member district plurality system. So swings of votes have a large effect on the size of parties. And I think the UK election is not going to be a smooth event. The latest polls have shown that Reform, which is the party by Farage, which is the leader who basically, the former UKIP, who basically caused Brexit, so in 2016, has overcome the Conservative Party. And this might be very consequential. Also because it's eating into the large lead that Labour had until now over the Conservatives. So it might be more interesting than we think, but it teaches us also a lesson that in systems in 2-party systems based on plurality systems, populists of the right and of the left capture existing parties. I mean, this has happened in the Republican Party. This has happened to the Conservatives in the UK. And at some point it happened also to Labour in the UK when Corbyn was a leader. And the other election is in France. And France is an extremely delicate situation because it is an unnecessary election. It was called by the French president, who made a reckless bet, a completely irresponsible act, to call an election in a moment where the extreme right, pro-Putinist, pro-Russia party might get an absolute majority of the seats, and the projection have a fork that allow for that possibility of the party getting an absolute majority and therefore controlling the executive. In a very delicate moment, a pro-Putinist party in France, a nuclear power, in a moment of war with Russia in Ukraine. This is something that will have very, very large consequences for the geopolitics of the region. And also in a moment in which there is the war between Israel and Hamas, because France has the largest Muslim minority in Europe and the largest Jewish minority in Europe. And through social media, fake news, Russia is stirring this situation. So a very, very delicate situation in Europe with these 2 elections, plus some regional elections in Germany, in the eastern part of Germany, where the neo-Nazi party is particularly strong.
Okay, thank you. I got a lot of questions, so I'm going to pick a couple of them first. And I think most of them wanted to remain anonymous, but there are a few people who shared their names. I'm going to pick that question. So by Chu Ucher, I think this may be a question to Larry, but I think I welcome other people to comment. It's a very simple question. Why is the majority get ruled by the minority? How to prevent that? US or elsewhere? I mean, you mentioned about primary system that
Well, it's because of the institutional rules in the U.S. So I mentioned some of them. Time is short. I won't repeat what I said. But the most obvious, glaring, to my mind, outrageously democratic deficiency of the United States is the Electoral College, which enables literally the minority vote getter, the loser of even the plurality of the vote, to be elected president. It's happened twice in this century. And the irony is, I actually went back to the Federalist Papers and read the arguments about that, including by Alexander Hamilton. And one of the arguments he advanced for the Electoral College was to be a brake on populist passions. The idea was that you would have a body of wise people, experienced people, who would be a filter for populist passions and who would reject a potentially popular demagogue who, in the words of Hamilton, was dealing in, quote, the little arts of popularity. Well, as a result of the Electoral College that Hamilton gave us, of course there were other reasons as well to reconcile the interests of different states, we got a populist demagogue who was dealing in the little arts of popularity. But then you look at the filibuster in the Senate and the ability of 41 senators to block the will of the majority, even if it has a majority in the Senate and in the House and in the presidency. Levitsky and Ziblatt were quite passionate in both of their books, including the most recent one, which is a very good book, Tyranny of the Minority, which gives the answer to the question you asked in much deeper detail, in favoring the elimination of the filibuster. I was actually, Gi-wook, a little bit wary about doing so because of the populist era we're in, and because I anticipated the possibility that Trump or an authoritarian personality like him could return to the presidency. And if Trump returned to the presidency, won a majority of the Senate, which actually the Republicans are likely to do, and recaptured the House, which they're not likely to do, but which is possible, then you have what's called a trifecta. And the only brake on the drift toward authoritarianism would be the ability of Democratic senators to stage a filibuster against the most outrageous legislation. So, you have to pick your poison in whether you want to empower a minority as a check on runaway power, or you want to have pure majoritarianism. Our federal system in our very big country with federal distribution of power also is a kind of limited check on tyranny. But I think that the most powerful problem we face now is the tyranny of extreme minorities to dominate partisan politics through low turnout primaries. I can tell you there is no reform of democracy in the United States I more passionately and desperately want to see than this change in the electoral system to preferential voting with nonpartisan primaries. If you did that, I think you would liberate many members of Congress to no longer feel compelled to kiss the ring of this tyrant in order to survive politically.
Any other panelists want to make any comments on this question or move on to the next one? Okay, so let's see. There are a lot of questions here. Okay, so this is from Kim Jae-bum. So you can see that I'm picking questions from you guys who share your name. So let's see this one. So is there any country that has a political system similar to South Korea, so that South Korea can be followed, like Germany or other country. So in other words, is there any country that has a very similar system like South Korea, and then South Korea can possibly follow? Maybe Sanyok or Joanne or Germany, France.
Similar in what way? You mean socially or in its political institutions?
I guess politically, political institutions.
Of course, I think when we made our institutional setup, I think we emulated a lot of systems from other countries, like, for example, but I mean, the problem is that we had a very interesting mixture of these institutional arrangements. I mean, the legal system is largely Prussian-German, right? But the constitutional structure, this presidentialism, is a presidentialist, like the United States check and balance system, and that's why we remain as this interesting presidentialist constitutional structure. I think most of the democracies right now in Europe are parliamentarian, and not many. I mean, in the literature, I think in the so-called Western literature, I mean, the debate is already, it's a moot question. I mean, the parliamentarian constitutional structure is better than a presidential structure in terms of democratic quality. But I think the reason why I adopted that, we had different historical reasons, and that's why we adopted it. And regarding this question about whether we have similar systems to learn from, I think now, considering the developmental stage of the South Korean democracy, so to speak, I think it is no longer that productive to think of something to copy from and something to emulate. I think we need to, because I mean the institutions are generally so rooted in the local context, socio-economic context, and as well as cultural, cognitive context. I think we need to develop, as Joan mentioned earlier, regarding this very peculiar concept of democracy we developed, I mean, equating it with the direct presidential election, and the reason why the support for presidential structure is so strong. Like those kind of local knowledge is so important that I think it is no longer fruitful to talk about where we learn from, what are the most similar cases, and because the institutional matrix as it is historically developed is so unique and idiosyncratic, and I think systemic conversion for that matter is not very easy these days.
So I wanted to bring up Taiwan as a country that, broadly defined, similar to Korea in terms of having been a Japanese colony, having had authoritarian rule for some amount of time, experienced economic development, democratized around the same time. But it's interesting that if you look at these like scores and indices about how much freedom exists in the country or how democratic it is, Taiwan always ranks higher than South Korea. And in fact, in South Korea we have national security laws that limits freedom of speech on certain issues. Taiwan, a communist party exists, which is related to this point. We also know that Taiwan is the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. So it's interesting that, despite similarities when it comes to how democratic the two countries are, Taiwan has been ranking higher. But I think it's also interesting to go back to the previous point about institutions. So both South Korea and Taiwan have presidential system, but in Korea we have this 5-year one term. And that connects back to our authoritarian legacy. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone here, but I think the reason why presidents can only run for one time is because of our history of having military dictatorship. But Taiwan, they have, it's like the US, where it is 4-year term and you can run up to second time. We would know that, if you can possibly be the incumbent party for 8 years, there are certain issues and policies that you can implement that is harder to do in just 1 5-year term, right? But again, I think it also goes back to the history of how Korea had authoritarianism and how it democratized and how it might shape the minds of the people and how they conceive what the system should be. So that is, I think, is a challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, when you compare political systems, you immediately discover that there are trade-offs. And presidential majoritarian systems might be very accountable, so it's very easy to change the executive with the small swings of vote, but they're not very representative and they're more divisive. Proportional systems, so based on proportional representation, coalition governments are less effective and are also not so accountable because with big coalitions you don't really know who is responsible for certain decisions, especially with grand coalitions. I mean, the blame shifting is really a problem, but they seem to be more representative of minorities, of different opinions. Small parties get a chance. So I would agree that evidence show that parliamentary proportional systems have a better quality of democracy, and precisely because they are based on this principle of compromise. Coalitions need compromise, and therefore also better for long-term policy. Whereas in presidential system or majoritarian systems, policies can be reversed quite easily with a change of administration. I mean, we've seen this in the US.
Yeah, go ahead.
I actually have felt for a while that Germany has as good a constitutional structure as you're likely to find within democracies. It's a cabinet system. You know, you read the literature on presidentialism versus parliamentary government, and the arguments for parliamentarism are pretty persuasive. Frankly, to me, as an outsider, they get a lot more persuasive if you look at the last, 30 years of presidentialism, 35 in Korea, and you see one president after another crashing and burning. You know, if they're lucky, they get through 3 years of their term before they wind up at 30% in the polls. And if they're unlucky, they get to 2 years and they wind up at 20%. So this does not make for governability in a very effective way. And you know, an argument that Juan Lintz made for parliamentary rule is about the rigidity of presidentialism. You shouldn't have to use the extraordinary measure of impeachment to remove a president who's lost confidence, whatever the party. And so I also like the German electoral system because it's half and half. It's fully proportional in a way, but half the seats are elected from single-member districts. I will note that they are talking in Germany now about taking all the single-mandate seats and using preferential voting to select the winners of those, and I think that's an extremely interesting combination. But I want to say one more thing. I think you can look around, you can find better models. I think Korea could do better with some reform. The United States desperately needs institutional reform. But in the end, you know, the great writers on democracy, including the constitutional framers of the United States, understood this. The institutions are only as strong as the people who are charged with operating them and defending them. And if you have a constitutional court that's willing to bow down to authoritarian drift for political or partisan reasons, if you have a national legislature that will just cave in to authoritarian ambition, If you have cowardice and betrayal of democratic principle and apathy on the part of the citizenry, no institutional arrangement will save you. And honestly, it's the most important thing I have to say here. I'm not suggesting Korea is in particular trouble now democratically, but the US is. I don't think we should take democracy in France or Italy or many other places in Europe for granted. I think there's deep troubles in Latin America. In Brazil, people aren't paying attention. In Argentina, I could go on. And there needs to be a renewal of democratic faith. That's the most important thing I have to say here today.
Okay, so I'd like to take the question about the social media that you touched on briefly. And this might be the last topic given time limit. And I like this question especially because this is asking, what we as scholars can do, okay? Not what other people can do, but what we can do. So the question is from Kim Ye-sun. As a social media exacerbates the polarization, okay, what role can scholars, okay, like us, play to combat such misinformation and decline in academic leadership and intellectual discussions? So what can we as scholars do? Not other politicians, forget about other people, but what we can do. So maybe each of you can talk a couple of minutes, yeah.
Okay, so I think, as scholars, we conduct research, and we, more and more, we try to, use different sorts of data, and now, with technical advancements, we can gain access to big data. And if you think about some of the studies that have been published, for me, I study comparative politics in East Asia, and when the paper that came out by Gary King, Jennifer Pan, and Molly Roberts about China's censorship, I think that had a big impact on how people started to understand how China exercises censorship. And then recently we had research published in multiple major outlets accessing data from Facebook. And we thought that, I think many, especially scholars, are familiar with the results of this paper, but we thought that social media was playing a major role in political polarization, and the results are pretty nuanced, but I think the results overall showed us that maybe it was not doing as horrible as of a job that we thought social media was doing in terms of polarization and social media being an echo chamber and all that. So, I do think that, with research, we can, uncover patterns that people might not be aware of, or maybe demystify some, trends that we think that exist. Yeah, so I think that is what we can do as scholars to, utilize data and to, uncover these patterns.
Okay, Sonia, we can go this way.
As long as people trust scholars better than the journalists, or better than politicians, better than other professions, I think what scholars could do is to try to critically still point out some of the problems of the media ecosystem. I think this echo chamber issue, and also we have this very peculiar the media ecosystem in South Korea, in the sense that we have so many journalists joining politics or joining the state government. I think, and we are constantly questioning the neutrality or impartiality of the journalists, because they are promising, they are the political hopefuls, and we don't really trust their neutrality in that sense. And including that, I think we need to point out the problems of this entrepreneurial or business pressure of media companies, for example, and the market pressure, and other aspects of polarization that was facilitated, that was promoted by the SNS and media ecosystem as well. I think what we can do is critically point out the problems, and if possible, create some deliberative, fora, for discussing these issues.
It's not only journalists, but professors also in Korea join politics. Yeah.
I think it's a very good question. I mean, as scholars, we're also teachers. And one of the most important things that teachers should do is to develop this critical sense in students. And that should happen also in primary school, in high school, not only in universities. But an ability to question and the willingness to question the sources where data comes from, but also the logic and the solidity of theoretical arguments. I mean, this I think is perhaps the most important thing that we do as teachers, is to instill, to develop this critical sense in our students. And I think, I mean, this should spill over then to the population at large. I mean, citizens should be critical. They should question where information comes from. And this is why opinion formation is so important, that it doesn't happen only in social media, because in social media, you're rarely confronted to opposite opinions. And what we tell our students is that you don't have an opinion on your own in your room. You have an opinion when you debate it, when you confront it with a different opinion. Then you're forming this opinion. And that's why social media is so bad for this process of forming an opinion. So in universities, but also in schools, this is happening. It needs, again, to happen on a larger scale at the level of citizens. And this is what I was saying as a conclusion. We need critical citizens, not only angry citizens, but citizens that rationally evaluate information.
Thank you.
Larry?
So I strongly agree with that last comment, and I think there were many important ideas advanced by my three colleagues. Let me kind of extend one and mention a couple others. The extension is, I really think it is extremely important for scholars to model good behavior and not be part of the problem. Increasingly, intellectuals, are tempted by the devil of social media fame to tweet and post in ways that can be impulsive and polarizing in themselves. And it just doesn't help. I think that we have a solemn obligation as scholars, particularly if we think of ourselves as scholars of democracy, but as teachers, your insight, Danielle, is very important, to model better behavior and to act with restraint and to vet our own information. There are plenty of professors that are just hitting the retweet button on misinformation. And to teach the skills of digital literacy, fact-checking, getting outside the pillar of information and checking what we're reading. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I can't emphasize enough the importance of this. Anyone here who is a teacher at any level, grammar school, secondary school, college, this thing, don't allow it to be used in the classroom. And if you ever see a student pull out this item in your classroom, kick them out of the classroom and tell them they can't come back until they make a commitment not to look at this thing in between, in between the beginning and end of the class. Our governor of California, who often is very creative and sometimes does very wise and visionary things, has just submitted a bill to the California legislature that would ban the use of these things. I think in secondary and elementary school classrooms. Beyond that, I really recommend to you the new book by Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, called The Anxious Generation. We don't talk about this in discussions of democracy, but one obligation of democracy is to keep people safe. And we have a mental health crisis in the world right now. It's not just in the United States, but we see it on the Stanford campus. You know what I'm talking about, Gi-wook. We have a mental health crisis. And if you look at the rates of depression, eating disorders, all these other things, video game addictions, all of this started to climb inexorably and really alarmingly around 2006, 2007, 2008. There are those years again. And it all dates back to the rise of social media and people's obsession with them and judging themselves and being demeaned. And it's a very, very dangerous world. And Haidt has in this book, I think, extremely sensible and somewhat radical, but actually simple suggestions on how to deal with this. And the same things that will address the mental health crisis confronting our youth that is being substantially fed, if not created, by social media and the addictive, pernicious qualities of social media. It's also turbocharging polarization. I think we're going to look back on, in the not too distant future, by the way, I'm very struck by the fact, compared to when I first started coming here in the early 1990s, no one's smoking on the streets of Seoul anymore. I don't know, maybe it's illegal now, but it used to be wherever I went, there were cigarettes. And that's true in the US as well. And that's because we persuaded people that despite the efforts over decades of the tobacco companies to addict people to cigarettes, that it was dangerous, it was addictive, these companies were destroying public health, and we overcame that. And I think we're going to see the same thing with social media. We really need to encourage people to think about them and use them with much greater restraint.
So I guess then Silicon Valley is the one to blame for democratic backsliding, right? iPhone and Facebook and right. Anyway, thank you so much for your participation. Especially, I'm very encouraged by so many questions here. I mean, if I go through all the questions, maybe 2 more hours. But it's good to engage in those discussions. And as I mentioned earlier this week, we had a second Sustainable Democratic Roundtable. So we're going to produce a report in the coming weeks. So you might take a look when it comes out. So thanks again to our panelists and also your participation. Have a great day. Thank you.